Hello and welcome to the Northern Saga Russian History Podcast. My name is Alexander.
And I'm Philip.
Today we'll be discussing one of the most interesting people of Russian history, namely Peter the Great.
Yes, and as always, we have a little disclaimer here. We are not professional historians by any stretch of the imagination, and any sources we use will not be linked because we're lazy, but you are free to correct us if you do sincerely wish so. However, we do hope you are constructive in your criticism.
If the information that we copied directly from wikipedia.com is wrong, well, you can take it up with the crowdsourcing.
Yeah, you can take it up with the anonymous Wikipedia editors.
Right. Alright, so, Philip, what do you associate with the name Peter the Great?
I associate him building St. Petersburg on a marsh, just like from out of nowhere, and with him being like 2 meters tall. And
Over 2 meters.
Over 2 meters, yeah, even better. And him having a beard tax.
A beard tax.
Yeah, beard tax, yeah, not beer tax, yeah.
A bear tax probably also, but he's not particularly famous for that.
Yeah.
Right. Alright, so Peter the Great is mostly known as, in many ways, the father of the modern Russian nation, the person who transitioned the Russian nation from a mainly Eastern-oriented nation to a mainly Western-oriented nation.
Yeah.
One of his greatest accomplishments is, of course, building St. Petersburg, as you mentioned. It still stands today and is, I believe, like the fourth most populous city in Europe.
Yeah.
So, even though the population has fallen in recent decades.
Yeah.
So, in order to understand Peter the Great, who he was, first some background information is useful. So, Peter the Great was born in 1672.
Okay.
Now, Russia as a concept hadn't existed for very long at this point. Russia had, I think, only about 150 years since the princedom of Muscovy. No, not the princedom. I can't remember what the title is called. The point is, there was a prince of Muscovy who unified Russia and named himself Tsar of all Russias.
Yeah.
Or Tsar of Russia. Tsar of all Russias came later. So, and this Muscovite principality was a direct result of the Mongol conquest of Kievan Rus, which had happened almost 300 years prior, where you had the flourishing Kievan Rus state, as we have discussed in another episode, ruled by Viking descendants, which more or less fell apart both due to succession conflicts and the whole Mongol horde razing all its cities.
Yeah.
So, this idea of a unified Russia was kind of a new thing. Hadn't been around for very long, and the Russia at this time was quite poor. It didn't really, it could produce a lot of grain, it had good farmland, it has a decent population, but it didn't really have anything more.
Yeah.
And to make bad matters worse, around the change of the century, from the 16th century to the 17th century, you had a period in Russian history known as the Time of Troubles. Essentially, this was a succession conflict, which ended the Rurikovich dynasty, the descendants of Rurik, and replaced them with the Romanovs. This was a great famine, and a whole bunch of wars,
Right.
in which the new Russian state lost a bunch of territory, namely to Sweden, which will become important later.
Right.
Right. So, Peter the Great was born not very long after the Time of Troubles. The first Romanov leader of Russia was the father of Peter's father, or his grandfather.
Yeah.
Peter's father was Tsar Alexis, who was, as I said, the second Romanov ruler of Russia. And the Time of Troubles, even though it's been quite a few decades since it happened, was still quite fresh in everyone's minds, particularly because the Russian economy, it wasn't that good to begin with, but at this point was in ruins.
Yeah.
It was, there was really nothing left, and the Russian army consisted of, you had the couple of elite standing regiments known as the Streltsy, who were often corrupt and deposed rulers and such, as we will get to.
Yeah.
And then you had mass feudal peasant levies, which were known for their, good soldierness.
Yeah. That was sarcastic, of course.
Of course that was sarcastic. So, Alexis led Russia through what was known as the Deluge, which wasn't that big of a deal in Russia because it basically was, in a way, the Polish equivalent of the Time of Troubles, in which the Polish state nearly ceased to exist because, simultaneous invasion from Sweden, from Russia, the Zaporozhian Cossacks rose up, they had their own succession conflict, so... But in this conflict, Russia kind of came out the victor. They got a few territories,
Right.
namely Smolensk and Kiev. But, now this is important, they made a deal with the Poles that was, in return for Kiev, they would go to war with the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, which was quite threatening to the people of Eastern Europe at this time, because they had a very well-disciplined army and navy, and an expansionist rulers, and, heathen faith, kind of things you don't want in a neighbor.
Yeah, to say the least, yeah.
So, Tsar Alexis did a couple of things which are important to mention when speaking about Peter the Great. He did reform the Russian military. He tried to make it less of, mass peasant hordes and more of a standing elite disciplined force, and he hired a lot of Western advisors, which will be important later. And he also did something which would be a problem later, which is he created a schism in the Orthodox Church. Because this was not super long after the fall of Constantinople, which means the center of the Orthodox faith was slowly transitioning from Constantinople, which was now a heathen-controlled city, to Russia, which was the largest Eastern Orthodox area, and there were very few other Eastern Orthodox areas and nations. And Tsar Alexis, in conjunction with a leader in the Orthodox Church, made a series of reforms. A couple of them seemed really absurd, like making the cross with 3 fingers instead of 2.
Yeah.
But it created an entire schism, and a whole group of the Eastern Orthodox Church named themselves as the Old Believers and practiced separately from the state church.
Yeah.
Which, you don't want as a ruler.
Yeah, that doesn't really sound good.
No. And while Alexis was having this good time, first he got married. He had a marriage which resulted in a number of children, namely two boys, Fyodor and Ivan, and the girl, Sophia. They will all become important later.
Mm-hmm.
His first wife died, an untimely death, and he then married again, a noblewoman of Tatar descent, which Tatars are sort of the Russian term for Mongol Turkic descendants still living in the area, which were kind of looked down on, obviously, and kind of because of the whole raising and pillaging thing.
Mm-hmm.
And, with this Tatar,
yeah.
I don't know how to say it in English.
Tatar, I guess.
Tatar.
Yeah.
Right, with this Tatar noblewoman, she birthed Peter the Great. Or he was just known as Peter at this point, he hadn't become great yet.
Yeah.
But, to be continued. And other children, but they didn't do anything relevant. I think one of the girls was a poet or something.
Yeah, not really. Kind of pales into comparison to, like, Peter the Great,
Yeah, I mean, poetry is good and all, but is it great?
Not when you analyze it, no.
No, it's not. Alright, so Alexis dies. I mean, I don't think there was any foul play here, he just died, he was old. And the heir apparent is Fyodor, which was his first son. Or he had a couple of sons, but this being the Middle Ages, they all died. So Fyodor was the oldest one still alive.
Yeah.
Problem is, Fyodor is really weak and sickly. So the real person who is in charge of the government is a man called Artemon Malviev.
Okay.
Who's kind of who was an advisor to the former Tsar, and a very influential man in the Russian state, and he basically was the shadow Tsar in a way, because so during Fyodor's reign there were a number of good reforms, but this was probably not due to the weak and sickly Fyodor, probably due to Artemon Matviev.
Yeah.
Right. And Peter, he was kind of a favorite child of Alexis in some ways, so he got a very Western education, and was therefore Artemon Malviev was the benefactor of Peter. So they were allies, close friends, and Matviev would support Peter because he liked him, and even though Peter was just 10 years old at this time. Not very.
Yeah.
Now there was a problem. Fyodor, as I mentioned, he was weak and sickly. He dies without any children.
Okay.
And now you have two families of the Tsar's former wives. And both families have children.
Okay.
And they get into a conflict. Who's going to be the next Tsar?
Yeah, that's a recurring theme in all monarchies, pretty much.
Yeah, and Russia at this point doesn't have a clear primogenitor succession laws. The succession laws are sort of like in the air.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, usually it was decided by the boyars, who would usually decide the primogenitor, but... So, the heir apparent, according to primogenitor, is Ivan, who was of Alexis' first wife, but he has chronic health problems and his mind isn't really there. He's not capable of being a ruler.
Right. Was he insane or was he just dumb?
Chronic health problems, you couldn't deal with them in the Middle Ages.
Right? Yeah, right. But
the details aren't important. The point is he was not capable of ruling. He would probably be taken care of or given some sort of medicine nowadays.
Okay, but was this... Did he admit his own incompetence, or was this decided by some sort of council, or...
No, he was Tsar, or he would be elected Tsar.
Right.
But they were saying this man is not going to be fit to rule because he has his own health problems which make him incapable of making good decisions, and his mind wasn't really what you needed to be the ruler of one of the largest countries in Europe.
Right.
So the boyars, as I mentioned earlier, they like, or Artemon Matveev, I'm going to say this name a few times more, yeah. He has a lot of support with the boyars, because he was essentially their ruler for a while Fyodor was the Tsar. So they decide to elect Peter to rule.
Yeah.
Because he's clearly more capable, and he's, I believe, the only male son of Alexis that is not Ivan and doesn't have the chronic illness. And electing Peter, who was 10-year-old, would essentially put his mother, the Tatar noblewoman, in power as the regent, because 10-year-old is not a very good Tsar.
Yeah.
This is just something we have to admit. I mentioned...
Yeah. If history has told us anything, it's that 3 or 10-year-old rulers are, as a rule of thumb, quite incompetent, and they pave way for for nepotism and some outside influence.
Right. So in this case, because he's not married, his mother is the one who is the regent, which is the one practically in control. And as far as we know, Peter didn't care about ruling at this point. He's a 10-year-old.
Right. Yeah.
So I mentioned earlier the Streltsy, right? Mm-hmm. And they're very influential and powerful because they are the only standing army in Russia, and they are considered quite elite and very vital to the security of the realm. Mm-hmm. So I mentioned earlier Sophia, half-sister of Peter, who, with different succession laws, would be the heir apparent. She leads a rebellion because she is quite friends with a lot of the Streltsy because, they know her more. She's older, she had more time to conspire with them, etc., etc. So,
right.
But she finds out she doesn't really have them under control. So the Streltsy rise up in order to put Sophia on the throne, or at least do what she wants. And they murder a whole bunch of Peter's pals.
Right.
They murder his mother, a lot of the family members of his mother's side. And they murdered Artemon Matveev, who was his most important benefactor and supporter. And, without him, Peter doesn't have that much power left.
Right.
So there is a mass slaughter, a lot of terrible things happen, and eventually they decide on a compromise, which is that Peter and Ivan are going to be co-tsars.
Okay.
So now there's not one tsar, but two tsars.
Yeah, okay.
And one of them is incapable of being a tsar, and the other is a child.
Right.
So you can see where this is going. So Sophia is actually an autocratic ruler in power, but they make the appearance that Ivan and Peter, the 10-year-old, and the sickly person are in charge.
Right.
So they had two thrones in which Peter and Ivan would sit, and they had a special hole constructed in the back of the thrones so that they could tell Sophia, who would be hiding behind there, what the noble people were saying, and then she would
Oh,
tell
no.
them what to tell the noble people.
Jesus.
Yeah, so she was essentially using this her sick brother and child half brother in order to rule the realm and be an autocratic ruler.
Yeah.
So so now she's successful, she's happy, she's ruling Russia, and she finds out all the fun stuff associated with being a Russian ruler.
Yeah.
So who was Peter at this point? Well, he liked boats.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like come up later. Like,
This is going to be a recurring theme.
yeah, that he likes boats. Yeah.
Yeah, like there's the anecdote where he would, visit the shipyards and he would see the sailing ships from the west, and he would be fascinated by the fact that they can travel against the wind.
Yeah.
This whole, he's just completely obsessed with boats.
Mm.
And he really likes playing with toy soldiers.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. When I say toy soldiers, you probably think of toys.
Yeah, like 10 soldiers.
Yes.
Yeah.
But Peter's toy soldiers were people.
Oh.
They were his friends and, different courtiers at the palace.
Okay. What did he do to them?
No, he didn't do anything to them. He really liked military strategy. So
okay.
he would essentially form his... Imagine if you're at school, right?
Yeah.
And this one son of the king comes in and decides that you're going to be a regiment now, and he's going to instruct you as if you were soldiers.
Yeah. Okay.
That's essentially what Peter is doing.
Okay, so there was no fight to the death in the palace courtyard. Or
No.
No. Okay.
It's a bit more innocent than that.
Oh, okay.
Point is, he likes military strategy and wants to be a leader, but he doesn't really have control of an army, even though he is half a Tsar.
Yeah.
So he uses all his friends, and they will become important later. And his mother is like, Peter, can you stop playing with boats and pretending your friends are soldiers and get married?
Right.
So he does get married, but
How old is he now?
this is a bit later when he's getting married. I think he's 17 when his mother wants him to get married.
Okay.
And this marriage is super unsuccessful, and after 10 years, Peter just sends her to a convent so that he can get married again. As you do back then. So at this point, Peter is 17 years old. He is, as one would say, an absolute unit.
Okay.
He is 203 centimeters.
Oh, jeez.
Right? And this is very tall today, but consider that this is the Middle Ages, where the average person was significantly shorter
Yeah,
than today.
like the average. I mean, Napoleon was 5'7", which is 172 centimeters, and that was considered average.
Yes, and he is almost 40 centimeters more.
Right. Yeah.
This,
That'd be like the equivalent of having a 2.5 meter tall person today or something.
So he definitely he might have had some form of gigantism, because we know that his body was very weirdly proportioned.
Yeah.
It didn't look very natural. Although if you try to criticize the Tsar, or at this point the co-Tsar, that's not going to end well.
I mean, considering the amount of inbreeding,
Yeah, it's a miracle he managed to get that tall, but there's all sorts of health problems associated with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Which will also become relevant later.
Yeah.
And he, unlike most Russians and Russian nobility, he was very good friends with foreigners. He hung out almost solely with foreigners and foreign advisors. His mistresses were from different countries. He was obsessed with the West.
Right.
And he didn't really like the whole Russian culture. He saw value in the traditions, technology, culture of the West.
Right.
And therefore he decided to surround himself with all sorts of Westerners. Anyone he could find. He spent a lot of time in foreign quarters and cities and such.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is, while he is just playing with boats and toy soldiers,
Yeah.
his half-sister is having a hell of a time, because she's like, now that I have this power, well, it's not that easy to beat Tsar. And you remember that whole obligation to Poland in order to attack the Turk?
Yeah.
Yeah, she tries to do something about that. So, while the Turk doesn't border, or the Ottoman Empire, I should say,
Yeah.
that's more accurate, doesn't border Russia at this point. Russia does border the Crimean Khanate, which is essentially a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
So the Crimean Khan, his boss, is the Ottoman Sultan.
Mm-hmm.
And the Russians really want to get some territory from Crimea, the Crimean Khanate, not just because of their obligation to Poland, but because it's strategically valuable.
Yeah.
You know, Crimea has a tendency to be strategically valuable.
Yeah.
Particularly, there's a very important naval base in Azov,
Yeah.
which was a focal point, essentially, of the entire area. Crimea itself wasn't really a important naval base at this point. That's more of a modern thing.
Yeah.
But the thing is, Sophia, she fails. She sends in all these mass feudal levies, and they'll die, because the Ottomans actually have well-disciplined troops. They have an actual navy, and you know, they make short work of the. Even though the Russian army is huge, they still are able to make short work of it, because it's essentially an undisciplined mass of levied peasants.
Exactly.
And she hasn't really kept her friends. She has lost a lot of friends as well, particularly the Streltsy, the very important group I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
They're like, okay, we put you in power. Now what? Aren't you gonna help us? You know, give us more rights?
Yeah.
But she probably doesn't do that very well. She loses support of a lot of the nobility and the Streltsy. It goes quite poor for her. So Peter, he's 17, decides he's gonna seize power.
Yeah.
Technically, he is the Tsar, or half a Tsar. Or one out of two Tsars. Well, that is half a Tsar.
Yeah, I mean, formally he's off a Tsar, but in reality he's a third of a Tsar, I guess?
I mean,
Or
he technically
isn't a
he's
Tsar.
probably more than half of a Tsar, because his co-Tsar isn't capable of being a Tsar.
Right, sure, but like, yeah, well, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, you get where we're going. So he decides, probably with a lot of pressure from his mother, because he's 17, and his mother also wants power, because she knows if Peter is the sole Tsar and Sophia is gone, then she is the ruler.
Yeah.
Like was decided previously. So they orchestrate a coup against Sophia with the support of Streltsy. Sophia is sent to a convent. You know, apparently Peter has a tendency to send women he doesn't like to be nuns.
Right.
It's sort of a easy solution.
Sort of a monarchy thing.
Yeah, sort of a monarchy things.
Yeah.
So now, even though Sophia is no longer the regent, and Peter is technically the Tsar with Ivan, it's his mother that rules.
Yeah.
Although his mother only rules for another 2 years, because after that she dies. So she dies not long after that. She dies in 1694, and then Ivan dies in 1696, leaving Peter as the sole Tsar of Russia.
And how old is he now?
That is easy enough to find out, because he was born in 1672, so he's 24 at this point.
Right.
So if you have life goals, if you set goals for yourself for life, do you want to be Tsar of Russia at age 24? Seems pretty ambitious.
Yeah.
And he succeeded in his goal.
Oh.
So now he's like, okay, now I'm Tsar. What do I do now? Well, as we mentioned earlier, he really liked boats.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's like, we gotta make a huge navy for Russia, because a navy is key to protecting your trade, and that's the only way they could challenge the Ottomans.
Exactly, and also back then the navy was this was a very important part of just like overall power projection.
Yeah.
Just like being able to project your own power and to challenge other empires.
Yeah. At this point, the only viable port that Russia has is Arkhangelsk, which is, well, it's pretty icy. And I mean, you could make some boats there, but they'll kind of be stuck a lot of the time. And I mean, I guess you could travel to Norway and bomb some huts, but you know, that's not very good power projection.
Yeah.
So they need to secure ports. The Swedes had taken all of their Baltic coast previously in the time of troubles, and they had no border with the Black Sea because of the Crimean Khanate.
Right.
And also, he decides to do a lot of reforms, because he sees that the entire Russian system is sort of rotten to the core. Bureaucracy is filled with nepotism. Army is working towards political goals instead of victories. You know, the boyars, each trying to secure their own domain. So he decides to work towards a lot of reforms, which I will talk on a lot more. Yes. One of his more interesting... no. He decides that he needs to acquire a naval base in the Black Sea, namely Azov.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately belongs to the Turks. Which isn't perfect.
Yeah, it's not optimal.
So he decides to do exactly... First thing he does is exactly what his half-sister tried earlier. He tries to invade it with his army. And predictably, it went just as well.
Yeah.
It was a pretty terrible loss, unfortunately.
Right.
So, but now he says, okay, the only way I'm going to take Azov is by building a navy.
Okay.
So he sets on a massive naval construction project. At this point, he decides to do one of the most things he's famous for. He decides to go on his grand embassy, which is essentially him traveling all around Europe incognito in order to learn about their ways, their technology, etc.
Right.
And this is really weird for a Tsar.
Yeah, well, he did this incognito.
Yeah.
So, did he disguise himself, or what did he do?
Well, he would just pretend to either be some diplomat or functionary, or just a
Right.
common person.
Okay.
It's a bit funny because, for example, when working in a shipyard, as I mentioned earlier, he'd pretend to be Peter, the shipyard worker, and it's like, so how many people called Peter that are 203 centimeters live in the Netherlands in this time? I feel like the people around him knew.
Right. And they just played along because they didn't want to get shot or hanged, right?
Because usually monarchs, when they would visit another country, there'd be huge pomp and ceremony.
Yeah.
Right? It would be enormous, costly affairs, and they wouldn't really get anything done because they'd be too busy with shoving off and waving. So he just decided, I'm just going to go on a trip through Europe, you know, as you do. And all around Europe, he asks the various European leaders, can you help us with the old Turk problem, the old Ottomans? And they're like, no, the Spanish king does not have an heir, and we want Spain.
Right.
So they're like, no, you don't get any help. And then he's like, okay, if I can't get the Western Europeans to help me, I'm going to make my country more like the Western Europeans.
Yeah.
So he studies a lot of their society. For instance, their clothing and the way they groom themselves, which led him to instituting his famous beard tax back home. Because it was very customary, particularly in the church, among the nobility, to grow very long beards.
Right.
But he wanted to style his court and his nation according to European customs. So he then said, if you're going to have a long beard, you're going to pay a tax.
Yeah.
And to further the humiliation of people who refused, even if you did pay the tax, you got to wear a medallion around your neck that says, I pay the beard tax.
Right.
Wherever you go, you got to go your fancy beard and a medallion that says, I paid the beard tax.
So he basically stigmatized being, like, following Russian traditions.
Yes, he stigmatized sticking to Russian traditions. And the church really hate him for this. So, but he's going to do something about that later.
Oh.
So, the more interesting things that he does, he gathers allies on this trip. He gathers friends, particularly in Prussia and Hanover, because they have common enemies, both the Ottoman Empire and Sweden.
Yep.
Because everyone in Europe is kind of angry at Sweden at this point. And he, for instance, worked at a Dutch East India Company shipyard in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
And he's not there as a Tsar, he's there as a common man. And he's just asking the fellow workers for advice how to build a boat. So, right? And he joins them in the construction of a boat.
Right.
And he gains very good insight into how European shipbuilding, Western European. And, you know, the workers are like, you know that new guy? He's 203 centimeters. I've only heard of one guy who's 203 centimeters. And he just happens to be the ruler of Russia. No, it can't be.
Right. But like, why did he go there himself? Why didn't he, like, send an emissary or something, or a...
Because he was a bit eccentric.
Right. I mean, if the beard tax didn't tell me enough about his...
we already established he doesn't like traditional Russian things. He liked
Yeah.
people in Western Europe. So I assume while he was doing this, he was also creating a lot of little Peters all around Europe.
Right.
Because he also had a taste for non-Russian women.
Okay.
Yeah, so
right.
it's not only the ships.
Oh, Jesus. Oh, Peter.
I mean, all this time, he is the Tsar of the largest country, and he just decides to just leave. And sometimes he pretends to be a diplomat. Sometimes he admits who he is. Sometimes he pretends to be a common worker. But he gets all this insight. He also goes to Britain. He sees all the Royal Navy do like the naval equivalent of a parade.
Yeah.
It's a boatade.
Yeah. Sure.
And
They show off.
And he's like, wow, this is great. Why can't we have this?
Yeah.
And he goes to British Parliament. And he's like, how weird is it that you are allowed to talk about issues while you have a king? Because in Russia, it's like, no one questions the Tsar. Then they get sent to, a nice little place called Siberia.
Right.
But in Britain, it's like, they all debate things in Parliament. And this idea is so weird to him, but it inspires him to, to reform his nation. So in the middle of his trip, he gets a little call on his iPhone.
Yeah.
Probably, I don't know, carrier pigeon.
Yeah, like a pigeon. Or
Yeah, from the old homeland, saying that those Streltsy that first revolted against you, then helped you. They're revolting against you again.
Right.
And he's like, I better go do something about that. So he travels back to Russia. He arrives and he finds out that the Streltsy rebellion was easily crushed by some of his friends, probably Western European.
Yep.
And the Russian army took only like 2 casualties, which is like very unlike the Russian army.
Right.
So he's like, now, and these Streltsy, they tried to put Sofia back in power.
Yeah.
So what does he do?
He kills Sofia?
No.
Oh.
No. What does he do to all his problems?
He just goes back to Europe.
No.
No.
He brutally tortures and murders all the remaining conspirators. Like, they get buried alive, broken on the wheel, and he forces Sofia to watch. And yeah, as you do.
Yeah, like some brotherly and sisterly bonding, nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, and probably murdering a few of her close friends and family members to some degree, gruesomely torturing them, because this was the Middle Ages. Even though this sounds like a decent fellow, he's still going to be torturing people who oppose him.
Yeah, I mean, like what do we expect?
Yeah.
Like,
what do we expect? So at this point, Sofia is sent back to the convent, where she is isolated in a cell for the rest of her life, and constantly reminded with some tortured body that she shouldn't try to revolt. And there's like a famous painting of her in a convent with a body hanging outside the window.
Jesus.
As you do.
Yeah, as you do. Yeah, nothing out of the ordinary.
And he gets so inspired by this that he decides to get around to finally defeating the Turks.
Yep.
He's like, it's about time. So at this point, he actually wins.
Right.
He takes the fortress of Azov, partially due he studies Western tactics. And you remember his toy soldiers?
Yeah.
They've all grown up as well, and they've become his elite guard.
Right.
Who are extremely well disciplined in Western. Imagine your entire childhood just being learning discipline and military strategy.
And just being commanded by some like royalty.
This is why monarchies are great.
Yeah, like you come from childhood, like create your own personal guard. Hey, that's not.
And these personal guard would continue to exist up until 1917 as the personal lifeguards of the Tsar.
Right.
So that's they're all go back to his toy soldiers.
Wow.
And so with this and with the new navy, I presume he had some ports in the south, but probably not good ones.
Yeah.
He manages to defeat the Ottomans, captures the fortress of Azov, and then he realizes one thing.
Mm-hmm.
In Sweden recently got a new king.
Yeah.
And being a Swede and having this fancy army of not actually Swedes, decides, it's party time.
Yeah.
So he's like, well, they've just got a new king. Everyone hates them. I have lots of friends in Europe who hate them. Mm. So he immediately makes peace with the Ottomans. Yeah. Instead of pursuing his advantage, he says, give us Azov and I won't beat you up anymore.
Right.
And they're like, sure, you can have Azov. Mm. So then he So then he collects his. He decides that wars in the north are so much fun. They really need a great one.
Right.
A really great war in the north, a great northern war, one might say.
Yeah.
Which, because he really wanted access to the Baltic Sea, because there's so much delicious trade in the Baltic Sea, especially German coast and near Denmark.
Also herring.
And herring, but I don't think herring was a primary concern.
Yeah. Either way.
Yeah. And Sweden basically monopolized the Baltic Sea.
Right.
So he was like, he decided to make an anti-Sweden coalition.
Okay.
So it was essentially Russia and a bunch of German states, namely Prussia and Hanover, who wanted Sweden's northern German holdings.
Right.
And that sort of worked perfectly well because Peter wanted their Baltic Sea holdings and there's enough land for everyone.
Right.
And Sweden did have, at this point in time, the most well-disciplined and organized army in all of Europe. Small problem is they didn't have any men in their army. Or, like, they had a very tiny population compared to any other major power.
Right.
So they relied heavily on mercenaries, particularly from, like, Scotland and Germany.
Yeah,
in order to bolster their forces, which meant that while they could win a lot of battles, they were very bad at a protracted campaign, and Peter knew this.
Yeah.
So he rushes into war with his brand new, reformed army, his BFFs, toy soldiers, everyone, let's go party.
Yeah.
And the Swedes kind of win.
Okay.
They win a lot of battles. They crush Danish armies. And there's this famous battle at Narva, which ends in total and utter Russian defeat.
Right.
And the Swedes are like, well, now that we won, we're going to push our advantage. And Peter is like, well, you can enjoy the Russian winter as much as we can.
Yeah.
Because if there's anything history has told us, it's that the Russian winter isn't fun for anyone involved, particularly invaders.
Yeah, but like it's not really fun for the Russians either, though.
Yeah.
But,
no, but they kind of just gotten used to it.
Yeah.
So he pulls his back with his army to lick his wounds. The Swedes try to pursue. They make great progress across Russia. They decide to invade Ukraine, of all places. I don't understand. It doesn't even have a border with Sweden, but details.
Right.
So the Swedish army is severely worn out. They don't. Their supply lines are efficient, but they don't have enough men or equipment. Or equipment. They have a very tiny manufacturing base at home and very little manpower.
Right.
And they have a king who is very young, Karl XII, I believe, and he's a very capable military commander.
Right.
And winning at Narva, etc. But in a certain place in Ukraine called Poltava, he gets injured and he's unable to lead his troops.
Yeah.
So you got a second-rate commander. The Swedish troops are worn out. They've been marching for ages. Peter does the old tradition in Russia called scorched earth.
Yeah.
Where you burn your own people in order to stop an enemy advance.
A lot of recurring themes here.
Yeah, a lot of recurring themes. So he does scorched earth. The Swedes are hungry, angry, few in number.
Yeah.
And the Russians kind of just crush them utterly. Like, the Swedish army is never... With one battle, they end Sweden's status as a major power and completely and utterly destroy their army.
Right.
Because even though Sweden has won all these battles, they've not been able to replenish the losses. While the Russian peasants, they're like okay, bit of dark humor, but they breed like rabbits.
Right.
And so there's plenty of soldiers.
Yeah.
And Peter has just replenished his army and also learned from the Swedes, because he actually learns from his enemy instead of insisting on their time-old traditions.
Yeah.
Even though he does some of the good ones, like scorched earth. So at this point, it's the Russians' turn to push back, and at this point, it's also devolved into kind of a 1v1 between Russia and Sweden. Like, a bunch of other countries are involved, but they're not really important.
Right.
I mean, like, the Prussians probably got what they wanted, and so Russia pushes them back, takes the Baltic coast, occupies Finland. There is mass plunder and rape of Finland.
Oh.
Not very... So it was a particularly dark time for Finnish history, although not that the Russian peasantry, when the Swedes had advanced, had it any better.
Yeah.
During this campaign, I think also Peter meets his another mistress, which eventually becomes his wife and successor.
Right.
And at this point, he has captured the Baltic coast from the Swedes. They decide on a peace treaty. He gets all the Swedes' Baltic territories. He gets a lot of Karelia, and he's happy.
Yeah.
And he's like, now that I have access to the Baltic Sea, I want to really overdo this. I want to just build a giant middle finger to Sweden, right on their border.
Right.
Because in a former territory of Sweden called Ingermansland, I wonder, is that region called Karelia?
Ingermansland. Where is it?
It's at the mouth of the River Neva, right? St. Petersburg.
No, I don't think that's Karelia. No.
No. Fact of the matter is, the area is a swamp.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it has a very nice position at sort of the mouth of the Baltic Sea and a bunch of rivers and such. But it's a swamp. It's a marsh. It's not the best place for settlement.
Right.
Right. But Peter is like, well, it is the most easily populatable by Russians territory that he has acquired on the Baltic coast.
Yeah.
Because in the Baltic states, surprise, surprise, people live there. But in this place, it's barely populated.
Right.
So he undertakes a massive construction project involving a lot of basically enslaved peasants and a lot of Swedish prisoners of war. And they get to build a city.
Yeah.
In the swamp.
Yeah.
And obviously, Peter is not an egomaniac. So he decides he could have named the city after himself. But he's like, that would be too bad. Yeah. So he names the city again. He names the city, uses the name of his patron saint, who coincidentally also is named Peter.
St. Petersburg, yeah.
And note something interesting, that in English, we call it St. Petersburg. Berg is a German word. Yeah, it's not a Russian one. Yeah. While the term Petrograd came into use later.
Yeah.
It was mainly known as St. Petersburg. In a way, this wasn't a Russian city. It was built...
But do you think he named it St. Petersburg because of this infatuation he had with Westerners?
Probably, yeah. I mean, obviously, in Russian, you probably wouldn't call it St. Petersburg. But that was what it was called for all the world to see, in a way.
Exactly.
They used the German word. That's the point. And he didn't only use German. He used also, the chief architect of the city was a Frenchman, right? The canals were inspired by Venetians.
Right.
Right, and other Italians, the entire city was sort of built to be a reflection of all the best aspects of Western Europe.
Right.
And this city was very important to Peter, because he used considerable resources to build it up, and culminated all his knowledge about the West. And at the same time, he was building up a navy in the same area, which he used to basically prevent Sweden from ever retaking that area. Right. Because with Russia having naval dominance in the Baltic Sea, Sweden could not orchestrate an invasion.
Right.
So, in the end, it was extremely successful. Now that he's won all these victories, there's one thing Russia doesn't have that a lot of the Westerners have started having at this point, and that's an empire.
Right.
Russia's a tsardom.
Yeah.
So, Peter decides, I feel like we have enough land and enough prestige, and we've defeated our longtime enemies. I mean, except Poland, but they're basically dead at this point. And then he's like, I declare myself Emperor of all Russias.
Right.
And then they're like, you can't just declare yourself that. And he's like, I didn't say it. No. But no one tells him that he doesn't do that. So he does.
Right, so he just does that too.
Yeah, and formally establishes the Russian Empire as a distinct entity from the Tsardom of Russia.
Right, right.
So at this point, he wants to be considered as an equal to the British, to the French, to the Austrians, which is, his greatest dream. And Russia at this point becomes a lot more powerful because he does a lot of other useful things. He reforms every aspect of Russian society, namely the corrupt bureaucracy.
Yeah.
And difficult succession laws. Not succession laws for the Tsar, but for the boyars, the nobles.
Right.
Because they're, in a way, exploiting the system in order to get a lot of power. So he just said, we're going to do this, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
And he was very obsessed with establishing a meritocratic system. which would actually make the Russian bureaucracy surprisingly efficient up until 1917, because it.
Ooh, shade, throwing shade.
Oh, I'm saying surprisingly efficient because it was barely a bureaucracy to begin with.
Right.
There's this anecdote that when they took the Swedish territory of Livonia, they were like, they couldn't afford the bureaucracy that the Swedes had used before, because the Swedes had spent more on administering Livonia than they spent on administering their entire empire.
Right.
Which is really crazy when you think about it. So the entire bureaucracy reform was made extremely meritocratic, so that because nepotism had sort of become the norm.
Yeah.
Everyone was just out for personal power. People would get appointed because of their friends. So both in the bureaucracy and the military, meritocracy was supposedly going to become the norm. And this had a very particular name, which I can't recall at the top of my head. And he also made education compulsory for nobles.
Right.
So that the nobility had to send their children to the West to get educated, because they weren't really in a good place to get educated in Russia at this point.
Right.
And the state would actually pay for its nobility to be, the state's own coffers would pay for the nobility to be educated.
Okay.
Because Peter thought it was more important that the nobility gain all this wealth of knowledge that he gained from traveling the West instead of spending less money.
Right.
Which is really weird. No one has ever done this sort of thing before.
It's kind of progressive, like, in a sense. I mean, right now we're used to, like, that everyone has, compulsory education, right? And but still, like, only even just sending the nobles off to, like, education, like, on a compulsory basis, it's weirdly progressive for the time. I mean,
yeah, but it also had some negative consequences. It sort of established the Russian ruling class as distinct from their subjects.
Yeah, so
because their subjects spoke French. No, subjects spoke Russian.
Yeah.
The leadership spoke French.
Right.
They were ruled by the Romanovs, a dynasty from. Okay, the Rurikovich were not from Russia originally, but they had truly become Russian. But the Romanovs were sort of the people didn't feel like they were one of them. They were sort of.
Right.
Even though he's the Tsar, he's appointed by God, but he's not a Russian, he's the Tsar, in a way. And that's a lot of that sentiment probably came out in 1917, a lot later. Because, sure, giving the nobles education was good, but it wasn't a Russian education, it was a foreign education. Which means that no matter how much educational facility you establish in Russia, the common people and the nobility would be educated differently, and therefore think of themselves as not the same.
Exactly. So not only do we have, like, this disparity in that the nobility is always going to be educated and, like, the commoners aren't.
Yeah.
It's also differing education.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can bet how much the church loves this.
Yeah.
Because the church is a very fan of traditional Russian values, and the church is very important for the nobility to maintain power over the people in this time. So this didn't really set a good precedent, although it held together for a while. He reformed the military very heavily, from feudal levies to a professional standing army, largely copied from Prussia. I mean, he could copy Sweden, but he sort of beat them. So
yeah, he didn't really want to, like, out of spite. Yeah.
So he copied Prussia, which was the emerging military power in Europe.
Yeah.
Whereas Sweden was sort of the previous biggest military power in Europe. Now it was Prussia.
Yeah.
He modernized the Russian language to be sort of interchangeable between wherever it was used, because it probably had a lot of dialects, and people don't realize this, but the Russians are descended from a whole bunch of different Slavic tribes who had their own languages, and this probably led to communication being a bit of a problem over longer distances.
Right.
And he introduced the Julian calendar, which, I mean, the calendar is always fun in Russia generally nowadays because of the whole Orthodox Church and...
Yeah, well, he introduced the Julian calendar, but then didn't Russia also have the Gregorian calendar?
Yeah, this is probably the early source of a lot of the calendar troubles.
Right, because the entire confusion from, like, the October Revolution happening in November and the February Revolution happening in March is because of the calendars.
Because Russia never really... It took them a while to figure that out.
Right.
And he did extremely important thing with the church, because the patriarch was traditionally the leader of the Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
But the patriarch held a lot of power in one person.
Mm.
So after quite a lot of disputes, he decided to replace the patriarch with a synod, which is another name for a council. So
Yeah.
a group of priests or clergymen, which essentially made them have less direct power and gave the state more influence over the church.
Yeah.
And, that actually would remain in place also until, weirdly enough, in 1917, an unfortunate side effect was that the church got a patriarch back, which they have now. Which is, it's not what you associate with the October Revolution.
Yeah, exactly. Wow.
Now, Peter has done all of this. He managed to produce an heir, which his mistress turned wife, which is a bit of a weird way of doing things, particularly because his mistress turned wife was originally lowborn,
Right.
but had sort of just worked her way through the ranks all the way to the Tsar. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. Doesn't happen all the time.
No, and her name is Catherine.
Catherine the Great?
No, Catherine the First.
Oh.
Another Catherine.
Right, I'm not really that big on monarchies, so...
No, it can get a bit confusing, like with the whole Danish monarchs being only Christian Frederick
yeah.
over and over again.
Right.
Now, and he had an heir who became an adult and also had his own heir, but unfortunately there was a bit of a dispute between Peter and his heir, his only male heir, which ended up with his male heir being executed for treason against Peter.
Right.
As you do with your children,
Yeah. Different times, I guess.
You gotta discipline your children, and that means brutally having them brutally murdered, and
Yeah, no better discipline than death, right?
Yes, I mean, he can't complain anymore, he's dead.
Yeah.
So, and Peter wasn't the healthiest of people. I mean, he liked to drink, he liked to travel a lot, and, his body wasn't really fitting together.
Right.
He was a lot taller than humans are kind of supposed to be, particularly in this time. So he had a lot of health problems. So he had problems with his urinary tract and bladder.
Yep.
So doctors had to empty urine out of his bladder surgically.
Right.
Very disgusting.
Ugh.
And the anecdote is that while they were able to heal him somewhat, while he was walking one day, he saw a bunch of soldiers drowning, and he dove in to save them, and he did. But that exacerbated his problems beyond the medicine of the time and caused him to eventually die.
Right.
That story is definitely very anecdotal and not factual.
It's kind of legendary. Even.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
it's like the perfect end to a perfect leader.
You wouldn't look away from the fact that it could be possible, because he was generally an open-minded and, I dare say, virtuous person in general.
Yeah,
except for the whole non-virtuous things. And,
exactly, like torturing his sister's friends.
but he had very good PR.
Yeah,
I mean,
and this is maybe a part of that PR, right?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know if he was a virtuous or sinful person. We only know that what people thought and wrote down. But one can only speculate. And he, of course, died without nominating an heir, because primogeniturally speaking, the heir would be his grandson.
Yeah.
But he didn't really care, and he died.
Right.
And which ended up with his wife becoming Catherine, or becoming leader of Russia, and eventually transitioning into his grandson.
Right.
Which somewhat managed to maintain his legacy, somewhat. And then they went full circle a couple of 100 years later with the Slavophile movement, which is like, okay, we've gone too far west, now we've got to go back to the east, to the Slavs.
Yeah.
So that's pretty wacky.
Damn.
So that was Peter the Great.
Yeah, very interesting man. It's still we can see the effects of his again, infatuation with the West even today.
It's weird that if it hadn't been for Peter the Great, Russia might have more in common with, I don't know, China in terms of culture.
Yeah, like China or like the Mongols, or maybe even the Ottomans. Who knows?
Yeah, because Russia really was very Eastern oriented, particularly because of in the Kievan Rus times they've been heavily influenced by all the different Turkic nomads surrounding them.
Yeah.
and afterwards the Mongols also exerted severe influence. So if not for its westernization reforms, Russia would probably be a very different nation. And we can see the fruits of his labor in St. Petersburg, which, we both visited. We know it's a very beautiful city, has a lot to offer.
Definitely.
Even though it's built in a swamp.
Yeah, like, you don't really notice it.
No.
No.
You get this, like, Venetian impression.
Yeah.
It's
a very idyllic city. I would never have thought that it was built on a swamp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, I mean, he could essentially have just built a giant stone middle finger pointing towards Sweden.
Exactly.
But he instead decided to do something productive about it.
Yeah, and like even today, like St. Petersburg remains like one of Russia's most important ports, both military and civilian.
And the wacky thing is that without St. Petersburg, while Peter might have died, St. Petersburg carried on the westernization that he implemented, because it was the center for liberalism, socialism in Russia, and a lot of other things.
Right. Yeah. So, are we done now, or?
Yeah. I hope you've enjoyed our episode and learned about this interesting historical personality. I recommend reading up on some material.
Yeah, of course, we're absolutely not a replacement for any textbooks or any other source on this matter. We're just doing this purely for fun. So, yeah.
Yes. Have a nice day.
Yeah, and thank you.